Our top story tonight, 2 death row inmates scheduled to be executed tonight. We begin our team coverage tonight at the Cummins unit in Grady, Arkansas with Chris May, who has the latest there. Chris.
Aaron, good evening once again, where for the second time this week, the state of Arkansas is poised to carry out capital punishment verdicts against 2 death row inmates. The first, Stacy Johnson, for the 1993 strangulation death of Carol Heath, and also Ledell Lee for the murder of Debra Reese in her home in Jacksonville that same year. But just as the appeals process stopped the state from proceeding with its plans on Monday with 2 other inmates, certainly tonight's scheduled executions are far from a sure thing. However, within the past hour, one big obstacle to at least one of the executions here tonight has been removed. The Arkansas Supreme Court, a little bit after 4 o'clock today, cleared the way for the state to use a drug in its lethal injection protocol, a drug that the drug's maker had requested in court not be used for executions. Again, the Arkansas Supreme Court sweeping away that order tonight, and with that ruling, there is effectively nothing, at least at this point, short of executive clemency from Governor Hutchinson that would prevent the execution of Ledell Lee tonight. And with that, I want to bring in my colleague Alicia Dover, who has been following the Ledell Lee case for us tonight. And again, Alicia, things can change rapidly, but at this point, it looks like this one execution is on tonight.
That's right. It certainly can change at any moment, and there are a couple of things happening, but as you said, so far it is on. A couple of motions that have been filed actually in the state Supreme Court. One, Lee was saying that he had ineffective counsel, and then another motion he made with the state Supreme Court was a DNA retesting of some of the facts in the original case there. That has been denied from the state Supreme Court, the ineffective counsel. The one for the DNA testing is still pending, but that's not standing in the way of tonight's execution. For the federal, same case, they tried to run it through the federal system as well. The preliminary injunction there has been denied as well. I'm being told that that is being appealed to the 8th Circuit, but at this point, nothing standing in the way at this moment.
Okay, remind us of the details of this crime that has brought Ledell Lee to this point.
Yeah, very horrific crime, a murder of Debra Reese, a 1993 murder in Jacksonville. Just a really sad situation, and he was involved in other crimes as well. He was convicted of raping 2 other women and was also on trial at one point for the murder of Christine Lewis. That was a 1989 murder that ended in a hung jury. Prosecutors actually chose not to retry that one because he had already been sentenced to death for the murder of Debra Reese.
Okay, Alicia Dover with us here at Cummins. Will be all night as we await the status of Ledell Lee. Alicia, thank you very much.
Hey, Chris, we are outside the Cummins unit, not far from this police barricade, and not far from that police barricade are those protesters you mentioned. Only about 3 or 4 of them gathered here today, and most of those people are from out of state. They've actually encouraged the Arkansas anti-death penalty protesters to gather at the governor's mansion tonight for a vigil for what appears to be at least one execution tonight. That's supposed to start at 6 o'clock up in Little Rock. But of course, tonight there are several people gathered out here protesting. You know, unfortunately, as we've talked about, there's this back and forth in the legal system as to whether or not we'll be having executions. That's been very confusing for everybody involved, and especially those involved with the protesting. But again, at this point, it appears that there will be at least one execution tonight, and protesters, as we mentioned, 2 from Monday were stayed. 1 from today appears to still be stayed at this point. And they're viewing that as a victory for the anti-death penalty movement.
Every time there's not an execution, it's a good thing. Every time there is an execution, it's a bad thing. But the trend for executions across this country is downward. We've got the lowest number of executions in 20 years, the lowest number of new death sentences, the lowest number of new capital indictments. So that's the trend, and today Arkansas is bucking it, but the death penalty is on its way out.
Janelle Lilly joining us now to break down these cases. Janelle.
Well, Aaron, we've been tracking 9 separate lawsuits today. Any one of them could put a stop to this execution tonight, and it helps to think about them as roadblocks on kind of a windy highway. As we mentioned earlier in the newscast, the Arkansas Supreme Court lifted the restraining order, which was blocking the use of one of the drugs. That has paved the way for the execution of Ledell Lee. However, there are a couple of things that could happen to put a stop to that execution. Lee has a request in for a stay from the state Supreme Court and another one in federal court. Now, if one of those stays is granted in either court, his execution will be stopped. The other man, Stacey Johnson, has one roadblock stopping his execution tonight. Yesterday, the Arkansas Supreme Court put a stay on his execution after Johnson brought up some issues of DNA testing in that court. The Attorney General had strong words, though, for the court's decision, partly because the court didn't give a reason as to why it blocked the execution, only issuing an order and not an opinion. Rutledge asked the court to reconsider, reminding them that in 2006, the court itself held that additional DNA testing was not necessary for Stacey Johnson. And she went on to say that Johnson's victims, at minimum, deserve an explanation by the court. Certainly some strong language by the Attorney General, upset that the court is just issuing orders and no opinions explaining those orders alongside them.
A lot of roadblocks on this road.
Within the past few minutes, we have heard from the Arkansas Department of Corrections about just what's going on behind the gates in the distance. Let's listen now to Solomon Graves, who is the spokesman for the ADC.
At 7 p.m. At this point, we are preparing to move forward with the scheduled execution of inmate Ledell Lee, number 936.
There is reaction to all this at the governor's mansion tonight, where protesters have been out in force since the weekend. Our Kimberly Roosley is standing by with more on that. Kimberly?
Hey there, Chris. I am here, like you said, outside of the governor's mansion, where protesters who are against the death penalty have gathered here, and you can see there's a line of them behind me lining up against the brick wall here. And I want to bring in Ferronda Braswell. She's the executive director with the Arkansas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. So, Ferronda, talk to me about your reaction today. Ledell Lee's execution, as of right now, will go through.
Sure. We sat, and my colleague Mona from Equal Justice USA sat for the entire hearing on yesterday about the drugs in McKesson and their request to have their drugs returned to them. And it seemed really clear-cut, a really clear-cut property law question that the state is entirely in the wrong. And so it's really surprising that the United States Supreme Court, that the Supreme Court of Arkansas would rule and overturn that temporary restraining order that was issued. That is very surprising. And so we are here to hold vigil for Ledell Lee, who may be executed tonight.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We do have to get back out there to Chris. But again, they will be here tonight during the execution. But for Chris, for now, we'll send it back out there to you.
All right, Kimberly Roosley, thanks so much. Again, Ledell Lee scheduled to be put to death sometime after 7 o'clock tonight here at Cummins. We'll be here with the very latest. Beth, let's go back to you.
All right, Chris, thanks a lot. And be sure to stay tuned to Channel 7, our Facebook page and social media sites, as well as online at KATV.com for the very latest.
More news from the Supreme Court. There are no noted dissents, as the court denies all 5 requests for a stay of execution for Ledell Lee. We know that the justices throughout the day had ruled on some other cases involving all of the inmates here in Arkansas, and those had been 5-4 rulings, with the conservative members of the court, including the newest Justice Neil Gorsuch, siding against the idea of a stay. But again, the latest on Ledell Lee in particular cites no noted dissents by the Supreme Court of the United States. A very heavy responsibility for the 9 justices.
Absolutely is. And it's also very interesting, too, because this reminder here is an inmate that the entire time since 1993 has claimed he is innocent. He has never admitted to this crime, and also has requested DNA evidence that he says was not available when he was convicted of this crime. And his lawyers arguing for that he did not do it, maintaining his innocence all the way up until the very end.
The prosecutors, of course, saying there's no doubt about his guilt. I asked Governor Hutchinson last week if he had any questions about any of the guilt of any of these 8 inmates that have been scheduled for execution this month, he said absolutely not. He believes they're all guilty of these crimes. Alicia Dover writing once again that J.R. Davis, the governor's spokesman, speaking with the governor tonight, who says it's a somber night, but he does feel that this gave the family of Debra Reese closure. That's the word from J.R. Davis.
Chris, we're going to be joined by our very own reporter, Maureen Glisovic, who was one of the media witnesses tonight. Maureen, first off, obviously trying, but you want to talk to us briefly?
Yeah, I will give you guys a timeline of everything that was recorded. We just briefed me, the Associated Press reporter, as well as the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette. We just briefed everybody in the media room. So we were brought in there, and it was a while. Jeff Rosenzweig, as well as Lee Short, both attorneys, were also outside. It took a while for us to get inside, obviously. And so when we finally entered, I was in my seat at 11:43. By 11:44, that curtain was pulled open, where we saw ADC Director Wendy Kelly was standing above inmate Lee, asking him if he had any last words. He appeared and he was just looking, staring up, blinking, was not responding. She asked him again, Lee, do you have any last words? And he did not comment, did not ask. And that the injection started at 11:45. That is when his eyes kind of started to drift and they were still half open. There were 2 IV bags. There was an IV in each arm. He was already laid out on the table with IVs in his arms when we arrived before they pulled that curtain there. He was strapped down. He had a white sheet on him. All we could see was his head that was also strapped and his arms, but the white sheet pretty much covered him up to here. And then by 11:47, his eyes were almost fully closed at that point. His feet stayed upright, of course, the whole time. He was still breathing around that time. The first consciousness check came in at about 11:49. It appeared that inmate Lee was still swallowing a bit at that point. But when the consciousness check happened, it was a little bit of shaking of the head, checking the eyelashes like this. He also touched his eyeballs and then checked his sternum, chest area, if you will, around here. The fingers remained upright the entire time. At 11:51, it was hard to see if he was still swallowing or not. It appeared that the man that was doing the consciousness checks checked one side of his fingers, but I'm not sure exactly because we couldn't see that side of his arm. We couldn't see the left arm. And by 11:54, it was still questionable whether he was still breathing or not. Another head check came, and consciousness check. He listened and bent down for breathing by the nose. Then he checked with a stethoscope there, and that was around 11:55. And then he called out, and a coroner came in at 11:56 and pronounced inmate Lee deceased at 11:56. And so it took a total of 11 minutes from the time the injection started at 11:45 to when he was pronounced dead at 11:56. Once he was pronounced dead, ADC Director Wendy Kelly came out and basically confirmed that at 11:45 the injection started happening and that at 11:56 he was pronounced dead. Once that happened, we basically closed the curtains, and that is when the first row of witnesses left. Second row came up. There were a couple of attorneys, I want to say about a few, maybe 3 or 4 people inside of the witness room with us that were ADC employees, and then the rest were citizen witnesses. The AP and the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, as well as myself, were all 3 in the front row. And we all just kind of got up after row, dismissed. We got back into the car, and then we were just brought back here and had to media brief.
You mentioned, again, this all went down in a matter of, 11 minutes. Did that feel like an eternity, or did it feel quick?
Honestly, it was very seamless, if you will, and he didn't appear to have been suffering, and that is something that the Associated Press as well as the Demgaz reporter we all agreed on, and we were all watching, and that's what we mentioned in the media room. It seemed to just go step by step. Somebody asked us in there if employees felt rushed, and it didn't seem like anybody was rushed. We couldn't tell at what point each drug, other than the injection started at 11:45, we couldn't tell at what time or when they went to the next drug. because it was clear. Both IV bags were clear. You couldn't really see what was being pumped, if you will, through. So I don't imagine there was no color to it, so you weren't able to tell exactly what it was. But
we saw when you and the other witnesses piled into the van to go to that room. Did you know at that point that the execution would go forward? At what point did you know it was going to happen?
At the point we knew it was going to happen was when they let the citizen witnesses out of the van that was in front of us, because we were parked behind them. And when they opened that door, that is when we knew that they were putting those witnesses in. And then they opened our door because we were traveling in a separate truck than anyone else. And then that's when we were brought in. You know, the feeling of that it could happen, because I mean, we couldn't have any updates. We had no technology on us, so we had no idea what the U.S. Supreme Court had decided or what had happened legally. But it was kind of telling when Jeff Rosenzweig and Lee Short, both attorneys, were standing outside of the van there, and obviously they were part of the witness room as well. So that's kind of the feeling you got. But once they finally opened that door for the witnesses, we knew that it was going to happen.
You mentioned someone had a stethoscope. Was this an ADC employee? Was this a nurse, a doctor?
Yes. I mean, I believe, you know, the person doing the consciousness checks had to have had some type of medical background or license. I'm not sure. They didn't identify who exactly was inside of that room at that time. Obviously, we know that Wendy Kelly was one of those people. I believe that the warden was in there. But again, that still needs to be, you know, exactly confirmed that that was a warden. But to pronounce inmate Lee deceased, it was definitely brought in. A coroner was brought in to do that.
There's nothing normal about this process, but from your vantage point, it went according to plan. Nothing went wrong in terms of the process.
Nothing appeared to have gone wrong. There was no talking, and nobody talked in the witness area. The only time we really heard anybody else talking within the chamber was when Wendy Kelly asked him, and then when the ADC employee had asked for the coroner to come in. But it didn't seem rushed. It didn't seem that he suffered from anything. I mean, he was pretty out within a few minutes, and they checked, and then they checked again. They did 2 consciousness checks.
And we do understand that there were family members of Debra Reese in the room. Were you aware of them? Were you able to observe them?
Honestly, right now it's still questionable whether the victim's family was inside of the room with us or if they were in another location. We were at the front row, and so I did not get a chance to completely look back at everyone that was in there. So at this point I can't confirm, you know, whose victim's family was where and if they were inside with us or if that was all just state witnesses. But he didn't appear to suffer to any of us.
We'll be back here on Monday night for 2 scheduled executions, and then once again next Thursday for the final 1 of 8 scheduled executions, 4 of which have ended in stays, 1 of which tonight ends in the death of inmate Ledell Lee for the 1993 murder of Debra Reese in Jacksonville. That is the latest from Cummins Prison. We thank you for being with us throughout the night here on KATV.